Shalom, family. It's your brother Benaiah Ben Israel. And on this trip to Savannah, Georgia, driving down the long plantation road, I couldn't help but think, we've come a mighty, mighty long way. Yahuwah Sabaoth has brought us a mighty long way. From laboring in the hot, sweltering fields of the plantation to driving a minivan down that very road as free people. Hallelujah. He who endures to the end, the same shall be saved. You see, we previously reviewed references showing that the Brews were understood to be black. For example, Professor Abraham Melamad stated in his book, The Image of the Black in Jewish Culture, he states that a strong European tradition dating back to the Middle Ages maintained that the Brews were black. Or John Mackey in the 1700s states, a tall, thin, very black man, like a Spaniard or a Brew. Or is written in the sources of history when it says that the black Jews of Portugal. We then read references which tracked these Brews from Jerusalem to Spain by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon and General Titus of Rome. Then, following a great expulsion in 1492, we then find these Brews in various places such as in Africa. Then eventually, by way of the transatlantic slave trade, landing in places such as Brazil, Barbados, and eventually on the coast of Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. Here in Savannah, Georgia, we discovered Spanish and Portuguese Brews met on the same street as the First African Baptist Church. In fact, we also learned that these Brews lived in the same neighborhood as the First African Baptist Church, on the west side of Savannah. We even have the addresses of the Brews themselves. And as you can see, Isaac Nunez, Jew, arrived July the 10th, 1733, Lot 57 in Savannah. Samuel Nunez, Lot 43, a Jew, in Savannah. Daniel, son, Jew, Lot 47, Savannah. Moses, son, Jew, Lot 49, Savannah. Noah Shem, Jew, servant to Abraham, Menace. Noah Costa, Jew, servant to Samuel, Nunez. Now, we note that both Noah Shem and Noah Costa are listed as Jews being servants to fellow Jews. Let me say that again. Both Noah Shem and Noah Costa, who are Jews, they are listed as servants to fellow Jews. Not only that, we note that the servant Costa is a servant to a fellow Jew named Samuel Nunez. This is important because at a later date, Samuel Nunez is also listed as a slave owner. However, in 1733, slavery is prohibited in the state of Georgia. So for now, let's focus on the Jew servant named Costa. During this time, England sent many servants from Ireland to the New World to work as slaves and servants. In old documents, we find Costa or Da Costa shown to be from Ireland and listed as a people of color. They are listed as black or mulatto. For example, the following reference shows not some, but all Da Costas who came from Ireland were listed as people of color. They are referred to as mulattoes. The old definition, not the new definition, but the old definition of the word mulatto simply referred to someone with mixed European and African ancestry. As the following reference reads, and it reads, mulatto, 1590s, one who is the offspring of a European and a black African. This could be a mix of a white European and a black African, or a black European and a black African. And for clarity, we can find pictures of mulattoes in a Spanish museum today. And as you can see, these are who we would call black people today. All right, well, let's review. When the Brews landed in Savannah, Georgia, some of them were listed as servants. And one of the servants was named Costa, who are known to be a people of color in old books. And we remember that these Brews of color lived in the same neighborhood as the First African Baptist Church. Now, here's a map showing some of the lots where the Brews lived, near the First African Baptist Church. And as you can see, Lot 47, Lot 43, Lot 49, and Lot 57. Now, these lots are highlighted on the map. And we also note that there were 2 Brews named Nunez on the list, residing at lots 57 and Lot 43. So we can find descendants of Nunez, sometimes spelled with a Z at the end or an S at the end, listed as free Negro owner of slaves in the United States in 1830 in Georgia. Yes, people of color owned other people of color. However, this was mainly the result of family members attempting to buy the freedom of their loved ones out of slavery. Therefore, they were listed as slave owners. In fact, the founding pastor of the First African Baptist Church, Andrew Marshall, owned a slave. And it reads, a former South Carolina slave who moved to Savannah in 1766 at the age of 10, Marshall gained his freedom during the early national period and operated a profitable dray business, employing mainly free laborers, although he did own one slave for a short period of time in 1830. Now, Andrew Marshall briefly owned a slave in 1830, the same year we see Nunez listed as a Negro slave owner in 1830. Family, there's much more to our story that we need to know. For example, some African Americans share genetic DNA ancestry with North African Jews and Moroccan Jews, who are descendants of Jews of Spain and Portugal. In other words, North African and Moroccan Jew ancestry shows up in DNA results of some African Americans. We also see this connection in the DNA results of a direct relative of James Carr, a former pastor of the First African Baptist Church. Additionally, we found people with Portuguese and Spanish Jew surnames, such as Nunez and Lopez, show up in DNA results as relatives of some African Americans today. In fact, a comparison of certain African American DNA to DNA extracted or taken from archaeological sites in Spain and Portugal reveals that certain African Americans have ancestors who lived in Granada, Spain in roughly 500 AD, roughly 1,000 years before the start of the transatlantic slave trade. In other words, some African Americans have lived in Spain and Portugal for a very, very long time. And we have the DNA evidence to prove it. This type of genetic research is referred to as archaeogenetics. It involves extracting genetic material from archaeological sites from various places around the world and comparing the extracted DNA to people living today. And it confirms a positive match between African Americans and DNA extracted from an archaeological site in Granada, Spain, dating back to 500 AD. It also confirms a positive match with an archaeological site in Lisbon, Portugal, dating back to 1600 AD, further validating the history of the so-called Negro as the original Brews of Spain and Portugal. And Yah willing, we will go into greater detail in the upcoming Hidden Hebrews. But wait, there's more.
I'm so glad you're here because you can bring great clarity. Can you tell us a little bit about the Sephardic Jews? and how they were scattered because they went west?
I sure can.
Because the reason why I want to is because a lot of them, and a lot of people don't know this, are in the Caribbean.
They are.
In the islands.
And you're one of them. I know that.
I'm one of them.
I know that.
Because, a lot of folk don't know that those roots are there. One of the first batches of slaves that came to Jamaica, they were the Sephardic Jews. It's documented.
And they're all over the Caribbean,
over the Caribbean,
South America, Central America, and even the South Central United States.
Wow.
And DNA testing is a factor in all this now.
Not only do we see descendants of slaves with confirmed DNA connections to Spanish and Portuguese brews, we also see church pastors and the congregation self-identify as Israel, as Israel, as Israel, as Israel, as Israel.
And so when I say Chinese, I want you to scream out the nation that's associated with this. For example, if I say Chinese, you're going to say what? China. All right, let's say it with authority. When I say Chinese, you say what? China. All right, that's just a test right there. So here we go. Chinese. China. Russian. Russia. Italian. Italy. German. Germany. Swedish. Sweden. Korean. Korea. Egyptian. Egypt. Nigerian. Nigeria. Black.
Exactly. Tell him, Pastor. Tell him, Pastor. Black, nothing.
I hope you were able to successfully identify the issue.
What is heritage? How important is it? How is it defined according to the ancient Israelite text, which many refer to as the Bible? According to Genesis chapter 10, each of Noah's sons were given 3 key items, that is, the pillars of what constitutes a nation being considered a nation. These pillars are land, family, and tongues. The Oxford Dictionary confirms this, but adds valued objects to the definition of heritage. See, throughout the Bible, we see the importance of language. Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 9 gives a prophecy about the Most High returning his people to a pure language for the purpose of having a unified voice when we all call upon his literal name and the reputation that's associated with it. The entire 119th book of Psalms is dedicated to explaining each Hebrew letter and how they stress the importance of following Yah's laws, statutes, and commandments. In the book of Nehemiah, chapter 13, we see an incredible judgment take place. We witness the annulment of marriages due to the men marrying foreign women. This resulted in an entire generation of the children of Israel losing one of the 3 key pillars that defines a nation: their language, their language, their language.
Not only do we see descendants of slaves with confirmed DNA connections to Spanish and Portuguese brews, we also see church pastors and the congregation self-identify as Israel. As the following reference reads, and it reads, from 1900 onwards, North and South Carolina was overrun by black preachers who were propagating a doctrine according to which the lost tribe of the house of Israel was none other than the Negroes. And the next reference reads, and it reads, I went from there to Jonathan Bunn's near Bennington, East Jersey. There I labored in the neighborhood for some time. I found him and his family kind and affectionate, and he and his dear wife were a father and mother of Israel. And the next reference reads, and it reads, in 1785, Reverend Richard Watcoat was appointed on Baltimore Circuit. He was, I believe, a man of God. I found great strength in traveling with him, a father in Israel. And the next reference reads, I immediately called on Jane Hutt, who was still among us as a mother in Israel, to go with me. Now note that some of these references were pastors or reverends themselves, and that they refer to either themselves or people of their congregation as Israel. And also, as we reviewed in previous videos, the founding pastor Andrew Marshall and fellow church members call themselves or refer to themselves as Israel. As the following reference reads, and it reads, Andrew C. Marshall was born a slave, and he has traveled over a great part of the United States. He has by industry succeeded in purchasing himself and done many benevolent acts among his color, and has given to different institutions several $1,000s. The venerable father in Israel, Andrew C. Marshall. And the next reference reads, and it reads, when he was commanded to preach the gospel, he raised his dusky hand, stained in his own blood, drawn by his vile persecutors, and said with a trembling voice, with the manly heroism and Christian courage that the grace of God alone can fan into a burning eloquence, if you would stop me from preaching, cut off my head. This humble statement from our Father in Israel. We even see the First African Baptist Church honor one of its church fathers by referring to him as a prince in Israel. This plaque to the Prince of Israel is located inside the church near the front of the church. It's obvious the church fathers of the First African Baptist Church embraced and honored being Israel. What would the founding fathers think of the church today, who began embracing an Islamic Arabic origin instead of the Israelite origin which the church was founded upon? The foundation laid by Andrew Marshall, who was called the Venerable Father in Israel by another First African Baptist Church pastor, Reverend E.K. Love D.D. Not only did Reverend E.K. Love D.D. refer to the founding pastor of the church as Israel, he himself was a member of a distinguished group called the Israelite Society. The Israelite Society was an organization formed by Brews for Brews. In fact, when Spanish and Portuguese Brews moved from Georgia to Charleston, South Carolina, we see the formation of the Reformed Society of Israelites in the early 1820s. First African Baptist Church Reverend E.K. Love D.D. was listed as the treasurer of the Children's Israelite Society in Savannah, Georgia. And so we see First African Baptist Church pastors, along with various church congregations and their pastors, self-identify as Israel, joining an Israelite organization. Additionally, we see these Israelites also learn a little Hebrew on Sunday morning. Hebrew was part of the sermon and church documentation. For example, the following sermon preached to the First African Baptist Church congregation started off by teaching Hebrew. And the following reference reads, and it reads, there are 3 words of Hebrew origin, of a kindred nature expressing different shades of meaning of a banner. Oath represents a small sign or banner. Nes, an ensign, a token of a thing. And degal, a flag, a banner. A standard from the verbal form degal, to cover, to glitter, and to shine, or lift up a banner. And next, we also see Hebrew used in the following church requirement for ministers. Like many ministers today, they use Hebrew to gain a greater understanding of the Bible. As the following reference reads, and it reads, the minister of Christ, who wills to succeed, must be full of faith. The word faith is difficult to understand, though it has been used ever since the fall of man. It is hard to ascertain with precision the real meaning and the extent of this term. We have it, trust, confide, and in Hebrew, to lean on. Family, in addition to hearing Hebrew in church on Sunday morning, these slaves invoked the name of Yisrael when planning slave rebellions. In other words, when faced with certain death, these slaves read scriptures about Israel. As the following reference reads, and reads, presently, a man named Martin, Gabriel's brother, proposed religious services, caused the company to be duly seated, and began an impassioned exposition of scripture. Bearing upon the peerless theme, the Israelites were glowingly portrayed as a type of successful resistance to tyranny. And it was argued that now, as then, God would stretch forth his arm to save and would strengthen 100 to overthrow 1,000. Hallelujah. And the next reference reads, at this meeting, Vassie said, we were to take the guardhouse and magazines, to get arms, that we ought to rise up against the whites to get our liberties. He was the first to rise up and speak, and he read to us from the Bible how the children of Israel were delivered out of Egypt from bondage. He said that the rising would take place last Sunday night week. You see, family, there's a whole lot of Israel involved in the First African Baptist Church. And on the flip side, there's very little Arabic associated with the church. In fact, the slaves who built the church spoke very little Arabic. They were Gullah slaves, which is a Hebrew word, by the way. An in-depth study of the Gullah language by Dr. Lorenzo Dow Turner revealed that out of roughly 4,000 Gullah words, less than 1% of Gullah words could be traced back to Arabic words. Let me say that again. Less than 1% of Gullah words could be traced back to Arabic words. In other words, these slaves weren't Arabic-speaking slaves. Nor is it logical or reasonable to hypothesize that a people who speak less than 1% Arabic could write whole Arabic words or phrases on pews at the First African Baptist Church, in a church congregation who referred to themselves as Israel.
On my journey to understanding how to approach these writings on the pews, it began with understanding the Underground Railroad and the key components within it. One of the key components is the 9-patch quilt. This is the original quote from the First African Baptist Church website prior to the changes. The ceiling of the church is in the design of a 9-patch quilt, which represented that the church was a safe house for slaves. 9-patch quilts also served as a map and guide, informing people where to go next or what to look out for during their travel. This information is no longer listed on their website. This is vital information in understanding how to transliterate the pews.
Gullah slaves spoke and sung Negro spirituals with Hebrew words such as kumbaya. Not only are the words kumbaya perfect Hebrew, the slave then perfectly translated the meaning of these words when they sang, "Come by here, Lord, come by here, oh Lord, come by here." Kum is Strong's 6965, Bo or Ba is Strong's 935, and Ya is Strong's 3050. Even the word Gullah itself is Hebrew. It's Strong's 1353, and it means redemption or perhaps kin. The word Gullah is also said to be short for Angola, meaning that Gullah slaves were slaves that were taken from Angola. And if so, this is yet another reason why Gullah slaves are not Muslim, because the spread of Islam didn't quite make it down to Angola. The spread of Islam was primarily relegated to North and West Africa. On the following map, which shows the Islamic world before 1914, Islam is shown in green, yellow, and brown, and is primarily located in North and West Africa. Now, notice Angola is shown on the map as having zero to little Islamic influence before 1914. In other words, the slaves taken from Angola were not Muslim. Also, the Slave Voyages database, which catalogs transatlantic slave voyages, it shows the majority of slaves taken from Africa came from Angola, a place practically free of Islam. On the contrary, places such as Senegal with high Islamic population contributed small numbers compared to the number of slaves taken from Angola. It's important to note that even when slaves were taken from Muslim countries, Islamic law prevented Muslims from sending fellow Muslims into the transatlantic slave trade. Per Islamic law, only non-Muslims could be made slaves for the transatlantic slave trade. As the following reference reads, and it reads, "It is implied by this that non-Muslims, but not necessarily the people of the book, may have a state of war declared upon them by Muslims. In the ensuing conflict, captives may be taken. In the eyes of the law, unsubmitting non-Muslims are regarded as enemies, living in the abode of warfare. They are judged to have refused the necessary conditions of freedom, i.e., submission to Islam or protection of the Muslim territory, and consequently, they have forfeited the protection which would have secured for them the original freedom of the race of Adam." And the next reference reads, and it reads, "The Quran makes unequivocal statements about slavery and slaves. In one passage, it enjoins imposing the bonds of servitude on the unbelievers who may be taken in war." You see, Muslim slaves were forbidden on both sides of the trade. Muslim law forbid the use of Muslim slaves on the African side, and Spain and England forbid the use of Muslim slaves on the American side. As the following reference reads, and it reads, "Muslims were banned from the Americas as early as the 16th century. Long before today's anxiety about terror attacks, Spain and England feared that enslaved Africans would be more susceptible to revolt if they were Muslim." You may be wondering, if First African Baptist Church slaves in Savannah, self-identified as Israel, were part of the Israelite society, used and taught Hebrew in sermons and in documents, sang a Hebrew song, used a Hebrew name, Gullah, to identify themselves, invoked the remembrance of Israel when risking their lives in slave revolts, spoke less than 1% Arabic, and came from places that didn't have significant Muslim slaves, then how in the world could anyone possibly suggest that the slaves of the First African Baptist Church were Muslim Arabs? Where did this Muslim First African Baptist Church narrative come from? Well, let's first take a look at the evidence. For this, we will visit a website created by Dr. Muhammad Rahim. On Dr. Muhammad's website, he briefly discusses the historical data behind a Muslim slave narrative. And his comments are all we need to put this into proper perspective. He says, and I quote, "Though the historical record is scantily populated with their history, it reveals that West African Muslims brought to America carried their Islamic faith and cultural practices with them." Now, notice that Dr. Muhammad stated that historical records were scantily populated. And with that in mind, let's look up the definition of the word scant to make sure we're all on the same page. Scant, barely or scarcely sufficient, lacking in amplitude or quantity, having a small or insufficient supply. As you can see, when some suggest that the slave population in Savannah, Georgia were Muslim Arabs, they are suggesting something that is, and I quote, "barely or scarcely sufficient, lacking in amplitude or quantity, and having a small or insufficient supply." On Dr. Muhammad's website, he lists 5 examples of Muslim slaves in the area. However, a quick look at their enslavement reveals the unusual circumstances of their enslavement. For example, 3 of the 5 slaves mentioned were Muslim princes in slave trading nations, and the remaining 2 Muslim slaves were plantation taskmasters, forcing roughly 400 slaves to work on plantations. So as you can see, these slaves were the exception, not the rule.
Unfortunately, there is an assertive effort to erase or rewrite our history. Even within the Holy Scriptures, we see examples of erasing history, erasing prophecy, erasing culture, erasing information that contradicts deceptive actions and agendas. Jeremiah, the prophet, instructed Baruch to write the prophetic words of Yah as he dictated it to him. Due to his incarceration, Jeremiah instructed Baruch to take the words to the people of Israel and ultimately to the king. King Jehoiakim rejected the written word of the Most High and destroyed the rolls. Throughout history, people have made attempt after attempt to erase and reappropriate the culture of the Israelites. Other websites recorded the history of the First African Baptist Church, such as Word Slingers and Going on Faith. This is what their website says. The church also bears literal scars of the horror of slavery. Slaves constructed the church pews, and at the ends of each of them, there is ingrained cursive writing that is believed to be a dialect known as Cursive Hebrew that slaves brought with them to the New World from Africa. Did the 9-patch quilts serve as a map and guide to inform runaway slaves? Why was the 9-patch quilt reference removed from First African Baptist Church official website? I want to introduce to you the oral traditions that was passed down from generation to generation and ultimately was given to Ozella Williams. These are her own words. My mother told all of us the story, but I was the only one who paid attention. We lived on land in Callison, South Carolina, and McCormick County. We would all sit underneath a large oak tree at night, and our parents would tell us stories. This is where my mother and grandmother would show us how to quilt, holding up a particular quilt pattern. My grandmother or mother would instruct us in the sewing of it and also tell us how that particular pattern was placed inside of the story I told you. Ozella Williams also shared secret codes and the meaning of each one of them. On page 78 and 79 of the book titled Hidden in Plain View, it says this: when Ozella first revealed the code to Jackie, she instructed her to write down the numbers 1 through 10. She then listed 9 patterns and 1 phrase: monkey wrench, wagon wheel, log cabin, shoe fly, bow ties, cathedral church, double wedding rings, flying geese, drunkard's path, and tumbling boxes. Then Ozella recited the code. However, the code she recited also included the following quote pattern names: Bear's Paw, Crossroads, and Stars, in other words, North Star. Why were they excluded from the original list? We can't explain. According to Ozella, there were 10 quilts used to direct the slaves to take particular actions. Each quilt featured one of the 10 patterns. The 10 quilts were placed one at a time on a fence. Since it was common for quilts to be aired out frequently, masters and mistress would not be suspicious when seeing the quilts displayed in this fashion. This way, the slaves could non-verbally alert those who were escaping. Only one quilt would appear at any one time. Each quilt signaled a specific action for a slave to take at the particular time that the quilt was on view. Ozella explained that when the monkey wrench quilt pattern was displayed, the slaves were to gather all the tools they might need on the journey to freedom. The second quilt placed on the fence was the wagon wheel pattern, which signaled the slaves to pack all the things that would go in a wagon or that would be used in transit. When the quilt with the tumbling boxes pattern appeared, the slaves knew it was time to escape. How long each quilt remained on the fence before being replaced is not known. There is a number of arguments many present in an attempt to discredit this oral tradition. Some of the arguments are: it is unlikely that enslaved families would have invested such valuable resources in the production of quilts, primarily intended as one-time signals. Unfortunately, these arguments are presented from those who have no clue what a person would do for freedom. There's nothing a person would not do in his or her desire to be free. Many actually presented arguments such as, "I've never heard of that." Others have used arguments such as, quilts are not mentioned in the 19th century slave narratives or 1930s oral testimonies of former slaves. Realistically, who is going to write down what they did and what it meant? Who is going to write down this information, knowing what it can do if the information fell into the wrong hands? So is the 9-patch quilt an oral folklore? To answer this question, it starts with understanding another language I was able to confirm written on the pews.
The people who built these pews paid homage to Christ, but also left a surprising trace of another African religious past, Islam.
This is Arabic type of writing.
I came across this language a few years ago during my quest to crack the code of the pews. This language is called the Nsibiti, which leads me to the ancient writing system of the Ukara cloth. Nsibiti is an ancient system of graphic communication indigenous to the Ejagama peoples of northeastern Nigeria and southwestern Cameroon in the Cross River region. It is also used by neighboring Ibibio, Efik, and Igbo people. Aesthetically compelling and encoded, Nsibiti does not correspond to any one spoken language. It is an ideographic script whose symbols refer to abstract concepts, actions, or things, and whose use facilitates communication among peoples speaking different languages. This language has no connection or influence by the ancient Egyptians. There's no trace of any of these symbols in the Egyptian hieroglyphics. April 1905, T.D. Maxwell stumbled across this language by accident. He was teaching a class and made a statement that he would later regret. He said, "The people of Nigeria were a primitive people because they had no written language." A student of his from Nigeria, out of disgust, introduced the language to him. See, these symbols are all around us. Just recently, I identified some of the symbols on the clothing worn by the cast in Coming to America Part 2. So I want to deal with some key understandings of the Nsibiti symbols. This is coming from the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute of Great Britain and Ireland. It says, the same sign stands for different things. An example, the sign may be a man who is an onlooker or a messenger, a pillow, a tree that supports the roof of a house or the house itself. Sometimes, as in the last of these cases, this multiplication of meaning is easily explained. An example is a whip, a man with a whip. The same thing is expressed by different signs. In this case, there is always a subtle shade of meaning in the difference. This is most noteworthy in the case of signs representing men. Many separate acts or states of mind are thus represented. Make a note of the next paragraph. This is the key to understanding the writings on the pews. This will address the issue so many who have made attempts to transliterate the writings have failed. They failed because of their approach. See, the angle of attack is very important for a pilot to know when attempting to land an aircraft. If the angle of attack is off, the results can be catastrophic. There is no order in writing. A sign may be horizontal or vertical or oblique as suits the convenience of the writer. The consequence of this is that all the signs in a collection have to be interpreted before the meaning is plain. So how did this script originate? It is evidently a picture writing of considerable age, for already there is a certain amount of conventionality about some of these signs. An example, which means a man who makes trouble between two people. The native tradition of its origin is that it comes from the Uguakima section of the Igbo tribe. I want to reiterate a key point for you to understand. The symbols within this language are written at the convenience of the writer. All the signs in a collection have to be interpreted before the meaning is understood. I'm going to show you how that same rule applies not only to the symbols within this language, but also to the letters written on the pews. Our enslaved ancestors passed encrypted messages through songs, quilts, and braided hair. But it did not stop there. They used other objects such as the pews. This is coming from the First African Baptist Church, Savannah, Georgia's original website. The pews located in the balcony are original to the church. These pews were made by slaves and are nailed into the floor. On the outside of the pews are markings written in the African dialect known as cursive Hebrew. Why was the acknowledgement of cursive Hebrew changed to some Arabic writings on the pews? The word type simply means people or things having common characteristics. Common characteristics. Common characteristics. Common characteristics. I want to introduce you to a Semitic writing that can easily be mistaken for Arabic. Unfortunately, many have ran with the notion that the pew in question is Arabic. Again, the key word is type, which means having common characteristics. There is a language that resembles Arabic. As you see, it's not Arabic. That language is called Judeo-Spanish. This is a language that was spoken by the Sephardic Jews. This language can be written in print, which is called the Rashi. It can also be written in a cursive script called Soletreo. So how did this language reach the coast of Savannah? To answer that question, it starts with understanding the Spanish Inquisition. It is documented that the Sephardic Jews or Black Jews occupied territories in West Africa called Sao Tome. They also occupied territories in Brazil such as Salvador, such as Salvador, such as Salvador, such as Salvador. For the sake of time, I am only going to transliterate the middle word on this particular pew. The first word from the right has letters that overlap or appear to have been written over. The key to understanding how to read each pew is knowing that the pews read from top to bottom. This is equivalent to Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, Judaismo, and other Semitic languages that read from right to left. I want to make this clear. Professor David Bunis, who specializes in this language, does not support nor endorse what I am going to share with you. However, his work does. I am going to use his work on Judaismo and more specific Soletreo as a source, which gives a strong case that this Arabic type of writing is what you see on the pew in question. Let's start with the first letter. Now I can say with absolute confidence, this letter is the Yod. The Yod means redemption, hand, outstretched arms. In Judaismo, the Yod is basically a dot, but in the case of the pews, it would look like the lowercase L in the English language. In this case, it will look like this. The two Yods side by side at the beginning of a word is pronounced Yeh, as in Yevar. However, the two Yods side by side in the middle of a word makes the A sound. These Masoretic points is called the Sarai and the Sarai Yod. Again, both the Masoretic points or marks makes the long A sound. What's also interesting is that in the Germanic language, the two dots over the letter are called an umlaut, which makes the same A sound. The next letter is the Zion. The numeric value of this letter is 7. This letter means weapon. The letter Zion is written in this way with the exception of the hook at the bottom of the letter. Now I want to reiterate a key point for you to understand, and you will hear me repeat this over and over again. The symbols within this language are written at the convenience of the writer. All the signs in a collection have to be interpreted before the meaning is understood. The same rules applied not only for the symbols within this language, but also to the letters written on the pews. The next letter is the Resh. This letter means head, protocol. The letter Resh can be written in two ways. It can be written in the traditional Hebrew style, or it can be written to tower above the other letters. See, in Solatrio, the Resh followed by the two yods would be pronounced Re. Lastly, we have the letter Lamed. The numeric value of this letter is 30, and this letter means disciple, learn, teach. This letter takes several forms in Judaismo Solatrio. The predominant form is what you see, in many cases with a loop at the top of the letter. Again, I want to reiterate a key point for you to understand. The symbols within this language are written at the convenience of the writers. All the signs in a collection have to be interpreted before the meaning is understood. The same rules applied not only to the symbols within this language, but also to the letters written on the pews. Together, they are pronounced Yezre'el, 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 Yezre'el.
Not only do we see descendants of slaves with confirmed DNA connections to Spanish and Portuguese brews, we also see church pastors and the congregation self-identify as Israel, as Israel, as Israel.
I almost forgot. I did say that I would reveal to you another language on the pews in Savannah, Georgia. Initially, I was going to leave you with a cliffhanger. So let me turn your attention to another pew. Before I move forward with my partial transliteration, I want to reiterate a couple of points about the Ukiah cloth. Nsibidi is an ancient system of graphic communication indigenous to the Ejagam peoples of southeastern Nigeria and southwestern Cameroon in the Cross River region. It is also used by neighboring Ibibio, Efik, and Igbo peoples. Aesthetically compelling and encoded, Nsibidi does not correspond to any spoken language. It is an ideographic script whose symbols refer to abstract concepts, actions, or things, and whose use facilitates communication among peoples speaking different languages. The symbol on your screen resembles the capital letter I. This symbol or letter can have multiple meanings. This sign can be a man who is an onlooker, or a messenger, a pillow, a tree that supports the roof of a house, or the house itself. If we put the writings in the proper context of the climate and state of our ancestors during the 17th century, we would see that this letter can be transliterated to overseer or slave patrol. The next symbol can have multiple meanings, such as a whip, a man with a whip, and also a runner in the Ekpe play because they carried whips. Remember, there is no order of writing. A sign may be horizontal or vertical, as you see with this symbol, as suits the convenience of the writer. The consequences of this is that all the signs in a collection have to be interpreted before the meaning is plain. This symbol means a man who makes trouble between two people. These three symbols together means prevent danger. Now, bringing all what I shared with you together, this sign collectively serves as a warning. In this case, it means prevent danger from the overseers or slave patrols who carry whips and make trouble to all attempting to escape. Another thing I want to point out is that each pew reads from bottom to top. This is equivalent to the Hebrew language and other Semitic languages reading from right to left. Some pews have the incivity symbols at the header or footer of them. These symbols on a particular side of a pew, I believe, gives the overall message of it. Here's another example of a pew with incivity symbols on it. This cluster of what appears to be the Syriac block letter Kaf in Hebrew means palm of hand. The numerical value is 20. In the incivity language, this symbol means trek, journey, voyage, tracks, voyage, tracks, voyage, tracks.
And finally, as Dr. Kelly Richardson pointed out, when the church suggested that the writing on the pews were Arabic, they missed a critical, basic, fundamental principle of Arabic script. Certain letters within the words are attached. Sort of like when you write cursive in English, the letters within the words are attached, and the ones on the pews are not. How then can the writing on the pews be Arabic? Remember, this Arabic narrative is supported by, and I quote, barely or scarcely sufficient, lacking in amplitude or quantity, and having a small or insufficient supply, in this case, evidence. With that said, the Arabic narrative is not a viable alternative to the rightful truth that these blessed enslaved people who endured so much self-identified as Israel, not Muslims. Let's not dishonor their memory, the memory of the founding fathers of the First African Baptist Church, by giving them an identity that they never claimed. So with that, family, stay blessed. And as the old pastors of the First African Baptist Church would say, my brothers and sisters in Israel, Shalom.